Good morning. We're delighted to have you here today for our panel discussion on building more inclusive, responsible AI. I am Dia Nguyen. I have the express pleasure of leading a team of external consultants that help work with our customers on their responsible AI journey globally. And we are excited about being in this amazing theater today to have this conversation with a great esteemed panel of guests that will share with you some of the things that are things that you should be considering as you think about building AI-driven products or automated decision-making solutions. And they will give you a great bit of insight about what this looks like in practical terms, as well as some of what we're doing to advance and continue to explore the ways in which we can continuously build, as this is a new and emerging area of focus. I hope that you will find this session enlightening, hopefully inspiring in some ways, and it will also challenge you as you walk back and do work with in your businesses and with your companies. So with that, I want to invite our group, our team, here to introduce themselves and tell the audience a little bit about what they do with responsible AI. And we'll start off with, I guess, Michael, since you're right next to me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Kearns, and I am an Amazon scholar within AWS, which means that I divide my time between AWS and the computer science faculty at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I'm a career machine learning researcher, first and foremost, and I've been at AWS for about 2.5 years, and I'm very involved, somewhat complementary to Dia, on our very internally focused responsible AI efforts. So this means making sure that our product services and the underlying ML models behind them are as free from demographic bias as possible, are privacy preserving of sensitive data on which they were trained, that they're robust, explainable, and the like.
Maria?
I'm Maria Pazoglu, and I'm part of Thomson Reuters, a company that serves legal, tax, and news agencies around the world, providing content-based services. And I'm responsible for the BI and AI platforms, very much looking into how we can embed responsible AI within them to make sure we make, throughout the life cycle of the models, the right decisions.
My name is Charles Isbell. I'm a professor and the dean of the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. Like Michael, I've been a lifelong machine learning person. And in fact, our offices were right down from one another back at Bell Labs and AT&T Labs Day many decades ago. I spend most of my time thinking about modeling human behavior through machine learning, both to understand and to predict it, but also to influence and affect what people do. Thing that's sort of important here that's sort of worth adding besides my own research and the things that I think about is that I spend a lot of my time thinking about education and what it means to train people at the undergraduate and at the graduate level around computing generally and specifically machine learning and AI. And I think that that's actually probably central to a lot of the conversations we'll be having today.
So I told you all I had an esteemed panel. We've got some heavy hitters here, and I'm actually this is going to be fun for me. Hopefully it'll be as much fun for you all listening and learning from them. So why don't we just get started? We often talk about responsible AI, trustworthy AI being something that isn't just a technology problem. And of course, we're AWS, we're a technology company, and people will expect that we talk quite a bit about our services and our products. But tackling responsible and trustworthy AI is more than that. And so I'd like for you, Charles, to start off with, just talking a little bit about what is it really and what does that look like beyond technology?
So I think the key thing to think about when you have these conversations is that we're not talking about ethics. We're not just talking about being trustworthy, we're talking about responsibility. And what does that actually mean? What it means is you have to think very hard about the systems that you're building. First as systems, but also that you're building them, they're going to be used by people. It doesn't matter whether you're building a screwdriver, the moral equivalent of a screwdriver, a bridge, or whatever. These things are going to be used by people, and people are going to use them in particularly interesting ways. So it's impossible, if you're going to think about responsibility, think about the impact of what you're building, how it's going to be used, without thinking about the people who are going to be involved. And because the kind of technology that we're talking about here, machine learning, AI, computing, broadly speaking, is something that is general and can be applied far beyond the screwdriver or the hammer, it means that people are going to use this technology in ways that you haven't thought about. And that's going to be potentially wonderful for people. It's going to be potentially detrimental, and it can reflect on the things that you're going to end up building. So central and crucial to this conversation around what responsibility is it's about bringing in everyone who's going to be involved, the people who are before and the people who are after the systems that you're building. The mistake that so many of us make, and I've certainly made this mistake myself over the years, is to think about the technology we're building as if it's in isolation, as if there isn't a context which got us to build this, and there isn't a way that once it gets out in the wild and replicates out there that it's going to have impacts on people. So the central notion of responsibility, I think, is thinking about what we do as a profession and thinking about how what we do is going to impact and touch people in the world far beyond whatever our particular intent was. And that requires involving people, talking to people, and thinking through what the impacts are going to be.
So Maria, you at Thomson Reuters has already started down this path of it in thinking about this beyond the technology and actually putting things in place. Can you share with them a little bit of what you all have been doing?
Yeah, actually very much building on what Charles said about people. We believe that for the technology to work, we need to make sure that everyone that is related to that can actually understand why it's really important to have a solution around responsible AI. And that starts from the data scientists, that they will create a model and will look at a model, all the way to the product owner that are incentivized to put that model into production. So the things that we're doing is really educating. So we have a very high focus within Thomson Reuters on educating the whole of the community around what responsible AI means, what is the responsibilities that we need to have in terms of how we use data, how we use AI within our day-to-day activities and products. So we provide trainings for them. We have policies and standards that have been created by a specialized team within Thomson Reuters. And then we do a lot of continuous education around the work that needs to be done. So we will start with the trainings, the policies, and then we have ongoing evolution of those. And more than that, in cases where we need to have an escalation, let's say, or we need to have a mechanism that we can review the decisions that we make, we have forums that have leadership across the board that will be able to understand the models that we put into production, whether they are ethical, what considerations they made, how were they created, and what do we need to make sure that we continue to be very transparent and very fair with the models that we are creating for our customers.
So I love what you indexed on in terms of education, and it's one of the things that when we're engaging with our customers, we talk quite a bit about, right? Training and education, and how important that is, even as we connect to the degree to which we expect organizations to be accountable. I'd love to hear from you, and in particular, Charles and Michael, since you are in the education space, why is education valuable, and what kind of things should we be focusing on when we start talking about educating, individuals?
Yeah, I think my answer to that question would have been very, very different 10 years ago. So just to set a little bit of context, if you go back 10, certainly 15 years ago, machine learning and AI were still relatively obscure academic research disciplines. And we've gone from that to today it being a very large, powerful, standalone industry. And so, at places like Penn, and I'm sure at Georgia Tech, for time immemorial, undergraduate students have some sort of ethics requirement. And as far as I can tell, most of these courses prior to recent years essentially, tried to give you case studies of technology or ethical failures in the tech industry and essentially encourage you to just be a good person, which is great advice. But we're now at the point where a lot of the topics in responsible AI, like fairness and machine learning or privacy and the like, are really, they have strong technical content as well. So in addition to teaching students to be good people, there's actually science we can teach them now as well. And so, for example, in the last few years, I've been teaching a new course at Penn, an undergraduate class called Ethical Algorithm Design. And in this class, we spend time, first of all, talking about how bad things happen in the first place. In particular, how if you train an ML model for the usual criteria, which is just to optimize its predictive accuracy, you shouldn't expect to get anything else for free. So if I train a model for overall predictive accuracy, I shouldn't expect that the predictive accuracy on different demographic groups will be equal. And if you want that property as well, you need to do something specific about it. And so the course I teach, and I think a lot of other emerging courses around the world, are trying to do a balance of thinking about the ethical issues from a human perspective and a social perspective, but also sort of talking about science-based engineering solutions as well.
So Charles, we're talking about education as well. Like, how should we think about educating the next generation of data scientists? And I would even say even beyond the next generation of data scientists, because we recognize there are going to be roles and responsibility outside of what we might be thinking of today that need to be applicable. And what kind of things do you think we should be focused on as we train and think about education?
So there's a couple of answers to that, I think. So Michael gave, I think, a really nice sort of description of this as kind of a technical problem, which it is. And it's important to understand that you can bring math and science and engineering and computing to thinking about these problems. But if you pop up a level and you ask, who do we need to educate? How do we educate them? Whatever it is they're going to be doing, what does that look like? So I think you want to think about it in the abstract as, look, there are tool sets, right? There are things that you sort of know how to do and you know how to use. There's skill sets. There's things you kind of know how to do. But the important thing is that they're mindsets. They're ways of thinking. And fundamentally around the way education works is you have to get people thinking about the bigger problem, what the implications are going to be, and you have to get that ingrained in them because the specific problems that they're going to see 5 years from now, 25 years from now, are things that we can't particularly imagine. And if we attach it to some particular problem or some particular view or way of doing it, you're not actually going to be able to address the big problem that comes down or sort of see it going. I guess I would add that as you focus on thinking about mindsets, the ethics course that Michael mentioned is exactly right. We've been doing this for about 30 years. Up until about 3 years ago, the course was required, but was a prerequisite for nothing. So what happens is students take it their very last semester. They're not thinking about anything because they don't care. They're trying to get out. And no one thinks it's important, and the faculty sort of get this feeling, the students get this feeling, and it's just a thing that we tack on because we need it to be accredited. But now what's happening, and certainly what we've been doing at Georgia Tech, is it's not only a required class, it's a prerequisite for junior design. So after a year and a half of doing computing and thinking things through, you actually have to take this course before you ever do your design and implementation courses, before you ever get into your intro to AI, your intro to machine learning, your intro to networking and security. Long before you get there, you're forced to think about what responsibility means, what ethics means, what professionalism means, which means the intro AI course now knows you've thought about these things and you can change that, and has a huge impact by investing and integrating it in early into everything that you do.
So let's make a little shift, and I appreciate you talking about like what we focus on from an education perspective for our students and sort of next generation. But we have people here that are in the enterprise, right, or running organizations that are building models. What should they be thinking about in terms of educating their teams in preparation for what they build?
I think it's exactly the same thing. It's getting people to think about, you're not just building this little widget, you're not just building this little piece of this model that's going to go out in the world and it's never going to touch anything, but to start thinking from the beginning about how those models are going to impact your business. They're going to impact the kinds of the people you're trying to reach. Who are the people you're trying to reach? Are you talking to them and really understanding them as you kind of design these things? What is it that they need? How are they going to see things differently? If you don't do that, you end up with these consequences of the systems that you build that are embarrassing, that cause harm. And I'm not talking about, just to be very clear about this, I'm not talking about this from the point of view of let's do the right thing, let's all be happy. This is about actual consequences to the efficacy and usability of the systems that you have. It's no different from whether you're a 19-year-old taking your second computer science course, whether you're getting an MBA and you're thinking about how to build the system. Thinking about the whole system as people and technology and how they're going to be used is sort of crucial to getting anything done.
I like that. So like thinking about the whole system. So we're going to talk a little bit about like how do we take this from just education to now what we put in practice in an organization. And so Michael, you've been really close to our teams as they are developing, our products and helping to shape and lead. What does it look like taking what we know and what we've been studying in some of the research and taking that from just theory to practice? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you wade out into the research literature on responsible AI, which again basically didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago and is now a very large subfield of AI and machine learning, a lot of that research treats a lot of problems as if you really have control of the end-to-end solution, for example. And we're in a very different situation in AWS AI ML, for instance. So in particular, we're often offering vertical services like speech recognition, face recognition, NLP services. And we actually don't know what the final use case of our customers is all the time. And so when you're trying to bake responsible AI principles into your products and services, you have the additional challenge of trying to think about what the downstream use cases might be and what the effects of shifts in the data distribution or changes in lighting conditions in something like face recognition might be. And so this is a very challenging problem. It's a lot of very sort of blocking and tackling work, especially around data curation. And until I came to Amazon and started working with the transcribe team, I had no idea that just in North American English alone, there are dozens and dozens of different regional accents and dialects, right?
I learned that since
and
starting
so
this work.
a lot of the work just has to do, and so if you just build a speech recognition engine using sort of only a few of those regional accents and dialects, you will not perform well, and you will have demographic bias as well. And so a lot of the hard work is in curating, annotating, maintaining, data sets. You have to go out and get, native speakers of different accents and dialects, transcribe what they've said, and use that as training data and testing and evaluation data for your models. And so so what's interesting for me is, since I have a foot both in the research camp and in very, very applied internal work at AWS, a lot of that research work is very good, and it influences how we think at a high level. For instance, what is a good definition of fairness for a trained model? You might think that there's only one. Unfortunately, there are dozens, and they're often in tension or conflict with each other as well. But it's that sort of last mile problem of taking a high level idea like a particular notion of fairness for a trained model and really operationalizing it in a very specific context, like, let's say, speech transcription, with the additional problem that we don't exactly know what the conditions that particular service will be applied. There might be other regional accents that we didn't have well represented, or there might be things like acoustic conditions or background noise that we're just, didn't have in our training data. And so this is sort of a perpetual process of trying to improve our models, get better annotated data, and repeat.
So you've kind of heard a little bit about this at the sort of broad level where we are providing services. Maria, you all are doing this, where you're taking some of the best practices in what is theory and applying that to services and products that you're using. Can you share a little bit about what that looks like at Thomson Reuters?
Yeah, so one of the key things for us within Thomson Reuters is trust. So it's one of the highest values we have within the company. So we want our customers to trust our products. And all of our products, or most of our products, have AI embedded within them. So we wanted to make sure when we established the data analytics function roughly 2 years ago that we would have a whole team that's dedicated on data and model governance and ethics. So that was the first, I would say, decision that we made that made us put a lot of emphasis on actually building the best practices and and investing in the technology, investing in the solutions to accomplish what was needed for us to get to the ultimate goal that we want to make sure, when someone uses a product and they have AI within that product, that we know what were the considerations behind it, what are the ethical considerations, what are the explainability considerations, what data was used, why, etc. So starting from that, very much kind of to the point that Michael was making about the use case, we start with the data and the use case. So before someone even starts thinking about building the model, we're asking some basic questions like, why are you building this model? Who are you doing for? What types of data are you using? What are the privacy considerations that you have on top? And that is just like a lightweight, I would say, consideration just to make sure that before someone even starts to create any AI, they understand that they have a responsibility of considering the data, the ethics, and the use of that for the product or for the insight-driven AI. Then as they develop their model, then we move on into more of, I would say, the technology solutions that we have in place to be able to understand the ethical considerations of the model and the explainability considerations of the model, using Clarify in some cases or other things that we're building at the moment to get some base leveling of the model development And that then gets reviewed before something goes into production. So we have, let's say, a mechanism in place that once a model has been developed and it's now waiting to be moved into our products or into our insights, that we have a team that looks at all of these considerations, right? And then depending, they might kind of course correct or not course correct. And then when the model goes into production, we continue to monitor all of that. We'll continue to monitor the performance. We'll continue to monitor the ethical considerations of it. Because we believe that the life cycle of the model never stops, really. Like, you start with the data, you kind of go through the development life cycle, development life cycle, and then you sometimes go back into the data to fix things that you see are now drifting or are not behaving as it should. So we kind of really fundamentally built everything aligned to the AI model lifecycle to make sure that we consider responsibility of AI not just at the beginning, not just at the end, but continuously.
Yeah, I really like that. And you're speaking to having practically in place processes and structures that start off with something that Charles was mentioning earlier, like thinking about the full context and the way in which that product or that service is going to be used and who it might be affecting, right? Who are all the constituents or the consumers of that, the stakeholders, and really paying attention to that, right? I think that was very much in line with what you were saying, Charles.
Right, and I think you see this. So let's jump on this example. Let's take the example that Mike used around speech recognition. So imagine a world where all the speech recognition software was developed in Boston by a bunch of people who only ever spoke to other people from Boston. Think about what a terrible world that would be.
They have a certain accent.
They have a sort of accent, and it wouldn't work for anyone else. And that would be bad, clearly. Now, you go, oh, that's a nice example, but clearly it's silly. Nobody's ever going to do that. But actually, we do it all the time. We don't think about it necessarily, but we do it all the time. So I'm going to give you a really quick example of something that hit the machine learning world about a year and a half ago with Jan. I don't know how the rest of you were drawn into this. So there's a system that came out of North Carolina that was very good at taking low resolution images and creating new images from them that were high resolution. These are of people. So you take low block images of people and you generate images that are high resolution, and they're wonderful. And this stuff was out in the wild, is doing extremely well. People were very impressed with it. Well, once it got out in the world, people started using it, and they discovered a couple of interesting things. So one of the things they discovered is that if you put Barack Obama through this, it generates someone who is clearly ethnically white. And in fact, if it takes almost anyone who is not already what we would recognize in the United States as ethnically white and makes them ethnically white. And by the way, something that's subtle and harder to see is that it takes pictures of women and it makes them smile, right? Now, why is that? Well, it's because that's the data that it was trained on. At least that's sort of the argument that it went, the way the argument went. And we just should have done a better example with the data set. Well, a couple of things that I think sort of come out of that. One is, by the way, they took a picture of me and it turned me into a blonde-haired person who had exactly the same skin tone that I have, but very clearly you would all recognize as sort of ethnically white.
Can I get a copy of that?
It's out there in the world. Actually, the thing that bothered me most about it is it added 40 pounds, but that's a whole nother conversation. So people said, oh, that's just a data problem. Well, first off, saying it's just a data problem isn't very helpful, because why didn't you think about this in the first place? But even if it's just a data problem, well, that's testable. So it turns out that you go and you take that, and you say, to take the specific example that was used, well, instead of training it on people mostly from the United States and Western Europe, we'll train it on people from Senegal. Well, guess what? The system didn't work. It wasn't just a data problem. It turns out the structure of the way the network was built, the hyperparameters, all the things that we sort of throw in there and we don't think about, turns out did not work on darker skinned people, period. Right? So to me, what you learn from that is that unless you are very careful about thinking about the whole problem and how it might be used, you will create a system that will fool you into thinking that it works well. And then when it gets out in the wild, it will fail. And I think the question you have to ask yourself is, why is it, now that I've told you this, I know what you're all thinking, this is the first time you've heard about it, well, that was silly. They should have just gotten better data and they should have tested it. But they didn't, and these are very smart people who are very well intentioned. And why didn't they? Because of the set of people who were in the room. It just never occurred to them to ask those questions. Because why would it? They were solving a very specific problem. It was a technical problem. They didn't have to think about how it would be used or what sort of came in the front door before they ever got to the data. And then you end up with something that is technically very interesting, but also ultimately quite embarrassing for the people who created it.
You know, that's a really great example. I often use the example of seatbelts. And while that's not AI, it is technology. You said very well-intentioned people designed seatbelts in the 1950s with the intention of minimizing impact or harmful, injury and death for drivers, right, that were in accidents. And when they created seatbelts at that time, it was 80% men who were drivers. So they were designed for men. They didn't think about the 20% of the drivers that were women, and they certainly didn't consider that your child might be sitting in the back seat. And so when they first released seatbelts, they found that there were some increased harm and injury to women and to children. And then had to go back, and of course you know now that we create seatbelts and we test with dummies and of appropriate size for children and for women, and it's the same sort of example. A well-intentioned technology that had an adverse, an unintended impact because we didn't consider the totality of things. We didn't design for the outliers, and we certainly didn't have other people in the room to hopefully influence the way in which we were thinking about the solution and even perhaps testing it.
We are now all living with the consequences that HVAC systems were developed in the 1950s when the average worker was a 48-year-old male. And we're living with that 70 years later.
So why is this, Michael, it looked like you were leaning in to say something. Why is this a problem or a concern? Why are we harping on this? Why is this so important?
Well, the remark I was going to make, just on the example that Charles made and others like it, which is, I think, just a comment that I think one of the healthiest forces towards responsible AI right now is what I would call the AI activist community, which I say in only a positive way. And we think about this quite a bit internally at AWS, which is the fact that, it's not just that we have customers and that our customers have end users, for instance. And when I speak about AWS, I think this holds for a lot of other technology companies as well, possibly Thomson Reuters as well. But, we are in the business of creating commercial APIs to our services and models. And so we don't just have to anticipate downstream impact on customers and end users. We have to anticipate combinations of researchers and journalists opening an account on our commercially facing API and running any kind of experiment or test that they want on it and publicizing it. And like the example Charles gave of sort of image resolution improvement, a lot of the most egregious examples of responsible AI failures have been actually brought to light by external parties. And I think eventually we'll get to a point where more of that role is played by laws and regulation. But in the meantime, that community, I think, is incredibly valuable and important. And it's not just the work that they do, but their mere existence forces a lot of parties building technologies to think very carefully, not just about what's going to happen in a downstream use case that you expect or intend, but what's going to happen when your stuff gets out into the world and anybody on the internet can start experimenting around with it and posting embarrassing examples of its failures. And I think that is a very healthy thing right now.
I just hope that they do like the image recognition thing so that I can be smaller, because the COVID hasn't helped me at all, right? So you gain weight, I want to lose weight with mine. But so this question you brought up here about the value of sort of these external occurrences that expose failures. That's a huge risk, though, and companies like ours, perhaps you could say, can absorb some of that, but then you have organizations of other sizes that can't afford the trust or the lack of trust that comes from an exposure like that, or the reputational damage that sometimes can cause a company to fall, and so. I think that's part of why you're hearing from us some of this necessity for an intentional set of activities and process and structure and tools, right, to be able to address that.
Yeah. I mean, so there's a reactive side to the activist community, but then the best antidote to that is a proactive process and sort of, just design goals and inclusive design and just, even the idea of, focus groups where you take entirely non-technical people and tell them, hey, we're thinking about building this. You'd be surprised at how often the tech industry as a whole fails to realize that something that they think is really cool, actually most people think is creepy in some ways. And I won't name examples, but I'm sure all of you have your own favorite example of such an instance. And you just, sometimes you think like, this isn't even a technical failure. It's sort of like, why did you build this in the first place? Why? And you can't believe, really, that nobody asked that question when they were building it. Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Creepy is the word that my teenage sons use often. Yeah. Creepy, right? All of this
Computer science is a field very guilty of just doing things because they're possible, that weren't possible before. I have a venture capitalist friend that says, the next big thing always looks like a stupid toy to everyone when it first comes out. So things like social networks, when that came out, I remember there was a broad reaction, like, why in the world would I want to join this system in which I can exchange messages with, strangers, for example? And, maybe
here we are.
Crypto is the next example, I don't know.
So Maria, the whole notion of trust, and I think that you all at Thomson Reuters leaned into, taking a more proactive response so that you could earn and continue to build the trust of your customers, as opposed to what some might experience in the reactive way that we were describing. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
It is really, really important to us. I think, first of all, we think that it is a competitive advantage. I really believe that being ahead of the game in terms of ensuring that your AI is responsible and trustworthy is a key differentiator between other companies that don't do that, right? So both from a reputational damage perspective, but also generally about what people are now, as they become more educated, this is what they're looking for. Across all of the different, I would say, customers that we serve, I do think this is something that's really important for them, and it's something that is important even for the end customers like that use our products. But I would want to say, though, that it's not an easy journey. Just because we have the intention of making our AI trustworthy, it doesn't mean that it comes without any time or investment or cost. And there is always this balance between, product teams wanting to have more features and faster features versus the requirement that we might have within our central data analytics team on making sure that the AI is trustworthy embedded within these features, right? Because there is time. There is time to collect more data that will make your model more accurate. There is time to collect, to spend more time thinking about your model and thinking the considerations you've made. So it's really key when we're thinking about the processes that I was mentioning earlier, that we build them in a way that they don't kind of kill any innovation or creativity or add such a big overload to the overall development of AI that makes them unadoptable. And that, I think, is something that we take really seriously. We don't just think, okay, we want our AI to be trustworthy, we will have 100 policies that people will need to implement or think about without really thinking about the practical consequences of that, right? So we really are intentional about both sides, the theoretical requirements as well as the practical implementation.
Yeah, so I like that. And you mentioned something about both cost, right, and the consideration, and potentially there being a trade-off there. I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing this. Do you feel like, an organization, how did you make that decision to lean in and say, we're making this step, in spite of the cost?
As I mentioned, it's because we think that it's an advantage. I think it is something that, even if the market is not requesting it 100% at the moment now, they will request it in a few years from now. So it is an intentional, I would say, idea and an intentional move to do that in a way that ensures that whatever we create now will last in time, and we invest time now instead of investing time in the future. So we're really thinking and are intentional about it, and that agenda is something that is throughout all levels of Thomson Reuters, from the top levels to the data scientists, that they do care about the AI to be ethical. They will think about it. Sometimes they will think about it because it's a fun and interesting problem, let's be honest, more so than because they have to. But it is across all verticals and all horizontals of our organization.
Yeah, so that's really important, having this sort of top-level leadership and support and understanding that is being driven, throughout the organization, even down to our data scientists and others that are playing a lesser but very important role, in sort of development. Charles, it looks like you're...
Well, I want to point out everything that you said was true and important. Also worth pointing out, we're bad at this. I mean, we've only been doing this for a few years effectively. Of course we're bad at it. And the people, the organizations who invest in doing it will get better at it, and not only have better outcomes, but be able to do it more efficiently. I mean, what we're really missing here, when you think about systems engineering, you think about, it's software engineering. We are not trained to have process around how to do these kinds of things. And so we're not very good at it. But as we learn how to build process around it, we'll get better and better at it. It'll be faster. The cost will go down. The benefits will continue to accrue. So we have to be more methodical about this and become very good at how we think about these problems so that we can do them efficiently.
This is the right investment to make, and it's a good investment to make now. And I love what you said about us being bad at it, because I don't think that people expect that. Right now that this is an area of focus and we're seeing and hearing about some of the implications and risks, there is an expectation that companies have it right, and in particular big tech companies as well that are building products, that we have it right and that we're doing all the things necessary to control, to build responsibly, but that this notion of it being a journey doesn't, I think, come clear as much as you might want it to.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that the problems are hard and we're still feeling our way towards approaches to them. It's that, of course, it's a moving target also because the technology itself is evolving. So it's not a static problem, and maybe I'll give an example of that. I think we have a pretty good scientific understanding of how to enforce various notions of fairness in trained models that are solving simple prediction problems, like, classification, for instance, give a loan, don't give a loan, or regression problems like predict the probability that somebody will repay or default on a loan, for example. But as probably many of you know, right, one of the biggest developments in AI in recent years has been advances in generative models, right? Like large language models and things like GPT-3 and Stable Diffusion, these systems that you can go find right now on your laptop and use demos where you type in a prefix of text and it just starts auto-completing with coherent text, right? I mean, the first time I saw one of the more recent ones, I was just kind of amazed that just solving the statistical task of predicting the most likely next word already gives you correct grammar and syntax. So these are very powerful systems. And when I said that we have a good handle on what fairness might mean for simple classification or regression problems, I have no idea what it would mean for a generative language model to be fair. I could make up very narrow examples. One example is if you play with these systems and you type in a name that, say, in the US would be considered ungendered, like Chris, it will almost always autocomplete with pronouns that are male. So I could say, okay, one aspect of fairness should be for this list of ungendered names, you should have approximately equal distribution of pronouns. But that just feels like such a small little piece of the problem when you have these systems that are generating free-form natural language text and images. And so this is a problem that, while we're working hard on sort of things like classification and regression, suddenly there comes to life this entire new aspect of the research and the industry that we have to think from scratch about what responsible AI means.
Yeah. So we just, I don't know if this now sounds daunting for folks, right? Because we're saying this is a new and emerging area, this is complicated, there's a cost. I mean, are there real things that we should be doing and companies can be doing, even though there's the complexity that you talked about, so that we are building more inclusive and fairer systems?
Yeah, and I think it's more of the same of what we've all been discussing here. I'm just sort of emphasizing the point that there will never come a point, I think, where we say, okay, this is all wrapped up now. We have, this is the toolkit and sort of process guide for responsible AI, check these boxes and you'll be done, because it's such a fast-moving industry that there will always be new types of problems, new types of models arising. And so, again, to Maria's point, I think that companies that invest in this very, very early even though it's a daunting problem and it's a moving target, will be the ones to really reap the rewards, and their customers will reap those rewards as well.
It is, and I would say sometimes I get that, especially from data scientists that will say, okay, yes, what you're building works for this model, but it doesn't work for that model, that model, and that model. And I'm like, yeah, but that's fine. I'm still better off solving the problem for, like, let's say, starting with 20% of the cases, and then adding up like features and flexibility and capabilities to then expand more and more and more to cover ultimately, and I completely agree, like we will never cover 100% of the cases because the technology involves, but just because you can't solve every problem doesn't mean that you can't start with the problems you can solve. So we really take that approach of let's do the easy things first, or even some of the questions and the processes, they're agnostic of the technology you're using underneath or the type of model you're doing. They're really asking, what are you doing and why? And then really building on the capabilities as the models evolve. I think that's key, and just people shouldn't give up. Just because it's a difficult problem doesn't mean it's an impossible problem.
I like that, Charles.
I don't have anything to add. It's a hard problem that's got to be solved. I mean, if we don't solve this one, why are we bothering to solve things like vulnerabilities and systems? And this is just a thing that we have to do.
We just have to do, right. So we've been talking quite a bit about like this notion of the complexity, and I think this kind of brings us back to some of what we're doing or what's necessary to be done from a academic perspective, and then this close partnership that I believe is necessary with technology, with government, with academia, because of the evolving nature of things. You want to share a little bit about what you think there?
So that reminds me of something I wanted to add to something said earlier, and then I'll answer your question,
Okay.
which is, Michael brought up the activist AI folk, which he meant in only a positive way, as do I. But eventually, the government's going to get involved if we don't do this well, if y'all don't do this well. And I don't think we want to have that conversation of exactly what does it mean to regulate. We don't want, eventually it's going to happen because eventually everything like that happens, but there are ways for that to be positive and there's ways for that to be negative and to squash innovation. So, the government as a constituency, as a partner in this is very important. They're doing, both the Senate and the House are doing constant, they're investigating these things, they're calling people for testimony. They are a really important part of this, and they're going to make the laws and create the policies that are going to impact what we're able to do. So they have to be involved for that reason, if no other. I think if you focus, so it's important to focus on them as well, but if you focus on academia and industry, I think the simplest answer, which isn't too far from being wrong, is that we're working on different timescales, right? We're trying to solve problems. Our incentives are somewhat different. There are the theoreticians who worry about 5 years, 50 years from now, and that's the impact they're looking at. And then there are people worried about the next quarterly report. They're worried about, I've got to get this new feature out tomorrow because otherwise I'm going to be behind, right? And both of those drive innovation in a very different way. Mm-hmm. And the data all lives in industry. The compute power lives in industry. That's where it all is. But the people who are thinking about the problem 20 years out, 10 years out, most of them are in academia. And you've got to have both groups talking to one another or you're basically going to miss something big.
Michael, you're in an interesting place, right? Because you sit at the seat of that, partnered with us, of course, in what we're doing in terms of innovating, in our technology and also doing research. What do you think?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. To our earlier conversation around, education and responsible AI in universities, it's important to remember the somewhat obvious statement that the single greatest source by far of talent in the technology industry are universities, both at the undergraduate, master's, doctoral level, MBAs, et cetera. And so that, industry is dependent on our educational system and universities in particular for just producing and training the people that come to companies like Amazon and build technology, or Thomson Reuters. So to our earlier conversation, it's incredibly important that we get students to start thinking about these things at the earliest possible level. So, as Charles said, not just some elective you take in your last semester as a computer science undergrad, but early on and, from multiple different angles, the social, human angle, the technical angles as well. You know, more broadly, there's always a very interesting, both symbiotic but also somewhat tense relationship between academia and industry at the faculty level, right? So especially in areas like computer science, yeah. Well, you know, you go through these booms and busts, right? You go through periods where the tech industry is, you know, relatively settled and not in a period of massive growth. And so, you know, all of the tenured faculty at top universities are, you know, are in academia, advising doctoral students, doing research, et cetera. And then you will have these periods that kind of empty out the hallways in academia because, you know, it's sort of boom times in the technology industry. So we've, you know, in my career, this cycle has happened several times. When I first finished graduate school, basically the technology industry as we know it today didn't exist at all. And so, you know, people like Charles and I, we did go to industry, but we went to Bell Labs, which was, you know, sort of a famous think tank. It was like a university in industry. So I don't want to say it doesn't count, but but it kind of doesn't count in some ways. But you know, then the dot-com era came along, and really a lot of universities were having not just a hard time rostering their course loads, but you know, it was not a great time to be a graduate student because a lot of the top faculty in various parts of computer science had gone to industry for a while. And so this is what I mean by a symbiotic yet tense relationship, right? There's, you know, there's sort of a struggle for faculty level talent between industry and academia at any given time. And right now I think it's at some kind of equilibrium, but who knows what it'll look like a couple years from now.
So I know that we're closing in on time, and we probably want to give the audience, if they have a couple of questions, there are 2 mics on either aisle that you can come down to ask questions if anyone has. So we've given them a lot, I think. Hopefully you all feel like you've given them a lot. Are there things that you feel like are just really, you know, critical and important for us that we may not have tapped into, and in particular, I want to, we've been kind of skirting this a little bit in the area of like just the necessity for inclusion at levels perhaps, and be really explicit about that. We say that in the title, more inclusive and responsible AI, and we've been talking about kind of building for all, but what does the inclusive piece of this look like?
So I'll just, you know, there are reasons to be inclusive, and there's at least 2. One is it's the right thing to do. But the other is that if you don't do it, you end up with the kinds of situations we've talked about, including the you know, high resolution images that we give. And when you really look into those kinds of mistakes that get made, the answer is always the same. It's that the people who weren't in the room. So the way I tend to think about this is that it's about invisibility. So we tend to think of invisibility as someone's in front of me and I don't see them. But the actual invisibility is someone isn't in front of me and I don't notice their absence. And because they're not there being a part of the conversation, they don't inform the way that we build the systems get built, it all makes sense, confirmation bias kicks in, and then it's only later when it is far too late. We end up in this situation where the system's been built and fixing it, you'd have to start from it. So you're just patching it instead of actually designing it correctly from the beginning.
This becomes more important, right, when we think about the kinds of decisions that some of these systems are now making, and the direction that they're driving. Maria, thoughts about like the necessity for inclusion from that perspective?
Yeah, I think it's not just the right thing to do, it's I think the wise and smart thing to do, because surely you want a system that is just as accurate across all groups, right? Like for me, it's not just to me, there's a business reason why you should actually be inclusive with your AI. Just because you'll get better outcomes across all of the customers that you want to touch, or across all the users that you want to have. Why would you want to build something that is like very narrow, focused, and accurate to a specific group? To me, it's just as you know, an ethical decision as much as a business decision.
Right, so there'll be products that have very niche and specific focus that may perhaps will be targeted, but a lot of what we're building really should be much more applicable in more ways, and so how do we build?
Yeah, maybe on the topic of inclusion, I'll just sound an optimistic note. So I think, you know, and I'm sort of speaking as a researcher and academic here who's been around for a very long time. You know, computer science is infamous for its lack of diversity. But one hopeful thing that I've noticed, and this is my own anecdotal personal observation, is that on topics related specifically to responsible AI, if you look out at the research community, it is considerably more diverse and inclusive than the field of computer science broadly construed. So let me give an example. There's a conference now that's, and I think it's something like its 6th year, with the somewhat clunky name FACT, which stands for Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in AI and Machine Learning. Charles and I were both very involved in its organization this year. And my observation is, I went to the first version of this conference at NYU, I don't know, back in 2016 or 17. And I was really shocked how the roughly 250 people that showed up were an almost equal mix. There was great racial diversity, there was great gender diversity, there was great intellectual diversity. There was people like me and Charles, there was a heavy contingent of social scientists, there was a heavy contingent of legal scholars and economists, and even representatives from regulatory agencies in the United States. And so this doesn't surprise me in hindsight, because people that have some technical interest but care about the social human side of technology, and in particular AI and ML, they gravitate towards this topic, right? They would rather study this topic because they have that intersection of interests. So I think that's a very hopeful thing, that the topic itself is attracting a more diverse set of participants, and hopefully that'll grow outwards from that community.
Excellent. So I appreciate everyone for their questions. We'll be able to take some questions offline as we exit the stage, but we're at the end of our time. I just wanted to share with you all, there are still some other sessions happening this week focused on responsible AI, and so hopefully you'll have an opportunity to be able to dig into this topic a little bit more with a hands-on workshop that's later on in Chalk Talk today and tomorrow. So we invite you all to join some of our colleagues as they share on that topic. And finally, if you all would be so great as to complete this survey. I thought that there is a survey for this session. It should be in your in the app, and we would love to get your feedback and complete the survey for the session. Thank you so much for coming, and we can take a few questions offline. We appreciate you attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you.